means power. It is ours. Global Vision presents the television news magazine of Southern Africa.
It doesn't exist on television, and it doesn't exist.
I would actually appeal to the world that information is there and can be found.
Because it is important that people know what is happening.
This week, South Africa Now presents these stories. Freedom Day. Nelson Mandela makes his defiant walk to freedom while a nation celebrates wildly. Nelson Mandela dominating the coverage. His first speech in nearly 3 decades, seen by millions.
I stand here before you not as a prophet, but as a humble servant of you, the people.
You'll hear more of what he said and what he meant in his first press conference.
The armed struggle is merely defensive. It's a defensive act against the violence of apartheid. But we remain committed to peace.
His triumphant return to Soweto.
That will liberate us.
All of these stories and more this week on South Africa Now. But first, the uncensored news.
Dumelang. For this special show, we come to you from our newsroom. There are days when news events become world historical events, and that's what happened on Sunday, February 11th, 1990. African National Congress leader Nelson Mandela, the soul and symbol of South Africa's freedom movement, walked defiantly to freedom, touching off a sustained celebration and comments worldwide.
You've probably seen these pictures by now, with a delegation led by Cyril Ramaphosa, president of the Mine Workers Union. Nelson and Winnie walked proudly out of Victor Verster Prison. One of our reporters, who must remain unnamed for now, phoned in this description.
It was an absolutely amazing scene. I mean, there's Mandela and Winnie Mandela walked through the gates of Victor Verster, and it was bedlam outside the gates, but he had insisted that he actually be able to walk through the gates. Some had suggested it would have been a lot easier logistically to lift him out by a helicopter, but Mandela wanted to actually walk out to his freedom, and he did.
From that point, Mandela became the most public man in the world, triumphantly welcomed home to Soweto for a rally described as the largest in the history of South Africa. Soweto's Orlando Stadium was packed. Mandela was back.
Today, my return to Soweto fills my heart with joy. At the same time, I also return with a deep sadness, with a deep sense of sadness. Sadness to learn that you are still suffering under an inhuman system.
His speech stressed the inadequacy of black education in South Africa, calling it a crime. He urged the many children present to return to school.
The actual process of learning must take place in the schools. I want to add my voice, therefore, to the call made at the beginning of the year that all students must return to school.
His Soweto home was also a rallying point. Phyllis Crockett of National Public Radio was there.
I think the need of the people here, his neighbors who live in this area, to actually see him on the front lawn of his house talking to them, to see him walk through the front door of his house. And now that that has happened, people really seem to be satisfied.
Finally, on Tuesday night, Nelson Mandela sat down for a normal meal. The week leading up to Mandela's release was a turbulent one, with mass marches throughout the country, from 50,000 in Port Elizabeth to continuing protests against the cricket team from England playing in defiance of the cultural boycott. While covering the protests, police stopped us from taping.
Busy with the police action.
Okay.
And Filming is just going to worsen the situation. We don't want you to film it, that's it.
Other journalists were attacked by the police, including ABC's Carol Simpson. Some journalists can't even get in to cover the story. South Africa Now producer Danny Schechter received this letter 2 days before the release, rejecting a visa request. He was interviewed for a report by former CBS producer Richard Cohen on media coverage for the 11th Hour program on WNET in New York.
An event is not an event unless there's an anchorman present. And in South Africa this weekend, all three were there.
Lift the state of emergency. What a day. Here in South Africa, so much to think about, so much to contemplate.
All because of this man, Nelson Mandela. American networks are competing to be the first with the ultimate celebrity interview. But reporters can no longer move freely as they cover what is perhaps the most compelling human struggle in the world. In 1986, the lid came down.
As of today, it's going to be vastly more difficult for journalists to tell the world, and other South Africans for that matter, what is happening in that troubled nation.
Pictures of violent repression suddenly stopped. Scenes like this, captured by CBS News cameras, had elevated the consciousness of the world. Now cameras were not even allowed within sight of any police action. Suddenly, South Africa was no longer on the evening news or on the front pages of American newspapers. Television news is picture-driven. In 1986, the story didn't end with press restrictions, but when the dramatic pictures were gone, so were the networks. So the big guys are back.
From ABC News,
lobbying for the big interview. But what happens after Mandela Mania?
Is once Mandela is no longer a novelty to be covered, and once somebody scores the, quote, big interview, at that point I think the coverage is going to return to what it was before Mandela's release, and that is to say, very occasional.
Ironically, the South African government may be ending its ban on appearing on South Africa Now. UN Ambassador Jeremy Shearer shared his reaction to the Mandela release with Charlayne Hunter-Gault for a South Africa Now PBS special.
Oh yes, I was very moved. It really doesn't matter what you feel. A man who has been in prison for 27 years, for whatever reason, a prison is a prison, and when he rejoins his world and his family and his people, I think it is a very moving moment.
Where does Nelson Mandela stand on the issues facing his country today? On February 12th, he held his first press conference. Our camera was there.
In Cape Town, Nelson Mandela spoke to the press for the first time in almost 3 decades, flanked on his right by fellow ANC leader Walter Sisulu and his wife Albertina. To Mandela's left, his wife Winnie. Mandela addressed many issues. Negotiations. First, on conversations between the government and himself while still in prison.
There has been a lot of misunderstanding about it. I have been having discussions with the government for the last 3 years on 2 separate but related questions. The first one, in which I have been negotiating with the government, was the release of my colleague, Mr. Sisulu and others. As far as that is concerned, I have been negotiating. But the second issue has been one of a meeting between the ANC and the government. And there, I have been acting purely as a facilitator to bring these 2 major political organization bodies to the negotiating table.
Second, on his role as potential negotiator.
No person has the right in our organization to determine what his role is in the course of his struggle. We are loyal and disciplined members of the organization. It is the organization that will determine what role we should play. It is my intention to go to Lusaka at the earliest possible convenience. They will tell me what role I should play.
On armed struggle.
I have committed myself to the promotion of peace in the country. But I have done so as part and parcel of the decisions and campaigns which have been taken and launched by the ANC. There's no conflict whatsoever. There is not a single political organization in this country, inside and outside Parliament, which can ever compare with the ANC in its total commitment to peace. And we, the armed struggle, is merely defensive. It's a defensive act against the violence of apartheid. But we remain committed to peace. And if the government gives us the opportunity, if they normalize the situation, we are ready to make a positive contribution towards the peaceful settlement of the problems of this country.
On group rights and the protection of whites.
The ANC is very much concerned to address the question of the concern of whites over the demand of one person, one vote. And they insist on structural guarantees, that is the whites, to ensure that the realization of this demand does not result in the domination of whites by blacks. We understand those fears, and the ANC is concerned to address that problem and to find a solution which will suit both the blacks and the whites in this country.
This is Emily Kasriel. There were press conferences and celebrations worldwide. New York Mayor David Dinkins seconded Mandela's call for a step up in pressure, while young and old rejoiced.
The role of the international community in exerting the full weight of economic sanctions against Pretoria has never been more critical than now. Some, including the Bush administration, suggest the opposite, that the recent movement in South Africa warrants a relaxation of sanctions. They are wrong.
When Mandela walked out, I was great. I felt real happy. We were jumping all over the place, and we were just happy that he was out. And soon we hope that the whole South Africa will be free.
Oh, yes, it was marvelous. It was a thing that I've been fighting for a long time.
There will be other celebrations in New York later this week, as there have been in cities from Boston to Tokyo, London to Lusaka.
Of all the South Africans who have been waiting for Mandela, among the most passionate are the people who hang out at Kapitan's restaurant in Johannesburg, where Mandela and his then law partner Oliver Tambo used to stop for lunch. Phillip Tomlinson reports.
Just down the street from this magistrate court and the office building where Nelson Mandela and his partner Oliver Tambo practiced law is Kapitan's. Renowned for its curry and as South Africa's oldest Indian restaurant, some 28 years ago, Kapitan's was also Nelson Mandela's regular lunch spot.
He used to come here during lunch hour, and then after lunch when he knocked off from court, and sit with his friends and chat. And this is normally number 9 table. They would sit here.
Indeed, above the table is a handwritten letter from Victor Verster Prison, proclaiming that palates and tummies the world over can't forget Kapitan's culinary treats. It's signed Nelson. But Kapitan claims that at the time he had no idea Mandela was planning revolution over his favorite dish, chicken curry.
I was not aware of nothing. I mean, if it was something, if I was interested, I don't know what would have happened to me. But I was a businessman and I kept on interest on my business side, you see.
Customers have mixed opinions. While they agree he should have been released long ago, they say it might be difficult to get a table if Mandela should return to Kapitan's.
If Mandela wanted to come here, is there going to be space for anybody else in this restaurant?
Still, the Kapitans are anxiously awaiting their dinner with Nelson, and Mama Kapitan is certain he'll return.
Oh yes, you can never forget the curry. You ate my curry, you can never forget it, you too.
For South Africa Now, this is Phillip Tomlinson reporting.
You're watching South Africa Now, the television news magazine that goes behind the headlines.
Just hours after his release from prison, Mandela gave his first major speech. It was televised worldwide, and many of our regular viewers may have seen it already. Aside from its eloquence, it raises political issues that may not be familiar to people not aware of the political nuances and history of Mandela's struggle. To put some of the issues in context, we turn to Mark Swilling, a policy analyst and newspaper columnist in South Africa.
Today, I wish to report to you that my talks with the government have been aimed at normalizing the political situation in the country.
In all conflicts, and Nelson Mandela is acutely aware of this, there cannot be a move from conflict, all-out conflict, to negotiations without a mediator. And so Nelson Mandela has defined himself as the mediator.
Our resort to the armed struggle in 1960, with the formation of the military wing of the ANC, Umkhonto Wesizwe, was a purely defensive action against the violence of apartheid. The factors which necessitated the armed struggle still exist today. We have no option but to continue.
Nelson Mandela was arguing that the reasons that the ANC took up the armed struggle in the first place in 1960 have not disappeared. In other words, apartheid remains. However, by defining the armed struggle as a defensive strategy, Nelson Mandela is basically saying that the ANC never envisaged a violent seizure of power as a way of ending apartheid. The ANC was committed to negotiating at the end of the day a peaceful settlement, a peaceful transfer of power. The armed struggle was merely a mechanism to defend the people and pressurize the whites into accepting the need for coming to the negotiating table.
We express the hope that a climate conducive to a negotiated settlement would be created soon, so that there may no longer be the need for the armed struggle.
He mapped out in his speech what conditions would justify a change, and that would be the meeting of the preconditions for negotiations, which is releasing prisoners, allowing the exiles to return, lifting the state of emergency, and unbanning the organizations.
Negotiations cannot take a place above the heads or behind the backs of our people. It is our belief that the future of our country can only be determined by a body which is democratically elected on a non-racial basis.
And what Mandela has mapped out is a fairly clear-cut strategy, and it's the clearest we've seen from either of the two major parties in the conflict. The government now needs to face the issue of meeting the preconditions entirely. Its conception, however, is that it will retain control of the country and govern the country during the whole process. It is agreeable to the idea of a body that needs to be elected to formulate the new constitution, but it is not in agreement at this stage with the view that this should be elected on a non-racial basis.
I salute the United Democratic Front, the National Education Crisis Committee, the South African Youth Congress, the Transvaal and Natal Indian
It's not just a few great leaders who started chatting to one another between the president's office and the prisoner's cell. It's because of mass action of a direct kind on the streets, in the workplaces, in the schools and in the communities that have made it impossible for the government to continue to govern in the old way. I think one can say that they have never been closer on the question of negotiations, but there are some tricky, thorny issues which still need to be sorted out. And it's not going to be done in a sedate, clean-cut environment. The people are on the streets and the stakes are rising and people are beginning to die. So the pressure is on, and it's not clear how that is going to affect the whole process.
I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die.
The boldness of Mandela's commitment to being a mediator was extremely surprising and moving. Moments like this in history, the decisions of individuals do count, in particular individuals like him. And I think he's extremely courageously taken on that role because no one else could have. And as a result, it would have been less likely that this conflict would have moved into the negotiation phase that it is now going into. So this man matters.
You're watching South Africa Now. Coming up next, our culture segment, featuring the best music, film, drama, and artistic expression from Southern Africa.
Throughout the almost 30 years Nelson Mandela has been in prison, his message has continued to influence and affect millions, including a whole generation of people who had never even seen him before. Their passion for the man was often expressed through music. Free Nelson Mandela was recorded in the early 80s and performed in London by the group Special AKA. It is now a song of celebration. How different it feels now that he's free.
our program this week. We are grateful to our viewers who continue to respond to our financial crisis. For more information on the issues we cover, send a self-addressed stamped envelope to South Africa Now, P.O. Box 1907, Canal Street Station, New York, New York 10013. South Africa Now is produced by Global Vision on a non-profit basis in association with the Africa Fund, a tax-exempt organization providing assistance and relief to victims of apartheid. Thank you for joining us. On behalf of everyone at South Africa Now, I'm Fana Kekana. See you next week.
Nelson Mandela, Free at Last. A South Africa Now PBS special is available on home video for $14.95. Send check or money order to South Africa Now, 361 West Broadway, New York, New York, 10013.
South Africa Now is also supported by public television viewers like you.